Set 8 comes with massive item reworks that completely change how you itemize champions. I covered the major reworks in this 1 minute short, so that should bring you up to speed. Anyway, these reworks are pretty big and they're honestly great as the individual items feel much better and most items have been nerfed across the board to rein in their power, which greatly improves the overall game balance. So why do I say that items weren't changed enough? Well, these reworks didn't change the fundamental flaw with items, which are their recipes. Some components just have way too much value early game, especially at first carousel, because of the items that they can become, whilst other components are inflexible and frankly bad because the items they can become are not good early. I'll label these recipes with which items are valuable early and late game, items that are good early and late but lock you into either an AD or an AP comp, items that have more value in the late game, and finally items that are just terrible early. And the labels look something like this. Sword is very flexible as there are 3 items you can make that you can either play in an AD or an AP comp, but also there is an even split between the other AD and AP items. DB and IE are AD items and Hextech and Shojin are AP items. Bow has some options that allow you to flex between AP and AD comps, but it also has some of the best AD items like Ronins and Last Whisper, so for AD comps this item is essential. If you take Rod, then you're almost always going to play an AP comp as most of these items are suitable for an AP board. The same is true for Tier, but there are still some flex options for your frontline. Vest is very flexible as your frontline will always want these items to tank, although some of these items will have more value late game when there are more enemy units. Cloak has only one flex option, the rest path you into either an AD comp or an AP comp, whilst others are better as the game progresses. But Zephyr is a terrible item early as others will have a damage item while you just have an item that CCs a single unit for 5 seconds. It's great late game, but it's just terrible early. Health Belt is very flexible, but like Vest, you may struggle with damage early game with some of the tank options. And Glove has some good flex options, but you may find yourself going for crit builds on your carries. So clearly there is some discrepancy with the value of these components. And nothing has really changed with what items are the best to open with. Bow is still an amazing component to start with, especially when AD comps are meta, likewise Rod is a good start when AP comps are meta. As it stands right now, Sword, Belt and Vest are still the best item openers and Cloak will be the worst, which has been the case for many sets at this point. So these reworks to the items may be good, but they don't change how you play around items overall, and there are still clearly better openers than others. Don't get me wrong, the addition of Guardbreaker makes Belt and Glove starts feel a lot better and is a massive step in the right direction. But my point is that this change doesn't do anything for how linear say a Rod start could be. So they need to continue reworking or even replacing items like Banshee's Claw to improve on the overall item mechanic. Items next up should be Quicksilver and Zephyr, which, like Banshee, don't have much value in the early game, but they cannot buff these items any more than they already have, as these items would be ridiculously overpowered and built every single game. So now you may think that, oh, they should just change all the bad items in one go, right? Well, not quite. Changing so many items at once would throw the balance out the window. The item's strength would wildly vary in combination with other items, and that's not including the interactions with that set's mechanic or champions in that set.
I'm not playing this.
Items are the core of TFT, and making such drastic changes will be a massive learning curve to new and returning players, some of which may just not be willing to go through and drop the game.
So yeah, I'm gonna leave here.
Look back at set 5 and Shadow items. Players had to learn an entire new item system just to be able to play the set, and that was before augments were even a thing in TFT. So what's the actual solution then? Realistically, the devs can only rework a single item a set to not wildly change item balance and be a hassle to players. And well, the devs are already doing that. Set 6.5 replaced Guardian's Angel with Edge of Night, Set 7 replaced Frozen Heart with Protector's Vow, and now Set 8 is replacing Banshee's Claw with Guardbreaker. So as long as the devs correctly identify the problematic items, which they've been doing so far, then each set we should see a massive improvement on the item system. Okay, so all we have to do is wait a few sets and the item system will be perfect, right? Right? Yeah, well, no. Let's say all the items are perfectly balanced and we can take any item and do anything from there. But wait, if we can do anything from any item, then what's the point of the first carousel? At that point, the first carousel would only serve the purpose of allowing players to pick their items for their preferred comp, so forcing comps would become much easier. And because of that, it would make sense to remove the first carousel. And I imagine players may not like this change, as this would remove a lot of control from their hands, and the first carousel has been a part of TFT since its launch. So the solution to the current item problem still introduces more problems. But maybe this isn't the only solution, and there's another better solution out there. Maybe just switching around the recipes would be an easier and better solution. Let me know what you think, but now I'm going to go on a small rant about the removed item Banshee's Claw and a similar item Quicksilver. For CC immunity, Banshee's Claw was a great alternative to Quicksilver as it didn't need to put Claw on your carry, just a unit next to it and you can usually get the same amount of value. Of course, Claw only blocks one spell, but the massive AoE CC spell will take a lot of mana to cast, so Claw would usually block the first CC spell and a second cast would be much later, in which case Quicksilver would also not block it. Quicksilver's usefulness is very set dependent, usually CC abilities are late game, and so Quicksilver is more useful late game. So what if they added CC to cheaper units so we'd see a lot more CC sooner? Well, that's just a frustrating and frankly bad set to play. Set 7 is the prime example of this. There were early and late game units with CC, so it was something you had to be constantly wary of. The mid set addressed this by removing most of the early game CC. So it seems that the devs have taken the stance of having CC more so in the late game, which will mean that Quicksilver will also be more useful later. If you make Quicksilver early game or no one has many CC units late game, then you're not getting much value out of Quicksilver. So of course there will likely be CC units in your games, so let's say there's a lot of CC on your opponent's boards, but your carry already has 3 items. Your carry's already fully itemized so you can't give them a Quicksilver, but what you could have done in the past is have someone with a Banshee's Claw next to them. You will always get value out of Banshee's Claw as it blocks a first spell which could be a damaging or a CC ability. This is very powerful, and more importantly, if you see someone has a Banshee's Claw, you have some room for counterplay. You can position a unit to pop the shield's carry before your CC ability comes in. On the other hand, QSS grants immunity for 15 seconds, so you have to wait 15 seconds to be able to CC them. Of course, you may say, well, that's the point of the item. But my point is that 15 seconds of uninterruptible damage output is extremely powerful and leaves very little room for counterplay, whereas Banshee's Claw still had some room. Counterplay around Quicksilver would be to prolong combat for your CC to be effective, or to Zephyr the Quicksilver holder. If Quicksilver was suddenly removed, would that make CC abilities OP? Well yes, it would, absurdly so, but that's in their current form. They could quite easily be nerfed by increasing the mana cost or decreasing the CC duration so they're less frequent and impactful. But if Quicksilver was removed, then you would rarely ever see melee carries as they can get perma-stunned in your frontline. Quicksilver is an absolute necessity for melee carries in TFT, and this won't change until the devs add something where a unit can only be CC'd once every few seconds regardless of source to prevent frontline carries from getting stun locked. But this is a really weird rule between melee and ranged carries, and it may be confusing for players to understand if this rule was hidden. But every set introduces more and unique rules through traits, so this could easily make sense if it was tied to a trait instead. Quicksilver is a temporary fix to the bigger issue, which is the gap between melee and ranged carries. Banshee's Claw isn't useful for frontline carries as they will get hit by damage abilities and have their shield popped very easily. And Quicksilver is vastly superior to Banshee's Claw when there are numerous sources of CC that occur frequently in the first 15 seconds. In set 8, Quicksilver on your carry is very useful against Vel'Koz, who may regularly CC your carry with his low mana cost ult. So understandably, Banshee was cut over Quicksilver. That's not to say Quicksilver is a terrible item in this set. The conditional usefulness of Quicksilver is not so much of a problem because they've added other stats to Quicksilver. Attack speed and crit chance are very good on both casters and AD carries as it combos well with Infinity Edge and Jeweled Gauntlets. The devs have given this item levers that they can now use to balance the item, that being the CC immunity duration, the attack speed and the crit chance. So while I think that Quicksilver should have been removed instead of Banshee, it makes sense to keep Quicksilver as it's almost a necessary item in the current state of TFT, and they've made the item itself a lot better to play and use even if you don't get value out of the CC immunity. But I'm hoping that this item is no longer as necessary as it currently is in the future. And that's my mini rant over. I personally think that having no thematically themed items in this set is kinda sad. Dragon's Claw was great thematically in set 7, but having it tied so heavily to dragons was very cringe, so it makes sense that it's gone. But yeah, the item reworks are still great though, it will just take time to perfect the item system. And thank you for watching. If you want to see more from me, then check out what champions I think will be in set 9, or check out my video on whether dragons are a mistake or not in set 7. Remember to subscribe and I'll catch you in the next one.